Hey everyone, welcome to Remap. My name is Jared, and today we're taking a look at the brand new title by Sabre Interactive, Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine 2. Now, if you couldn't tell by the enormous title, Space Marine 2 is the latest entry in the Warhammer 40k universe. Warhammer is a miniature war game that was published back in the 80s and has evolved way past its model origins. There are tons of books, games, and shows all set in the Warhammer universe that continuously add and expand to the lore. And this is what got me interested in trying out Space Marine 2, because I love the lore of Warhammer 40k, even though I've never actually played the miniature game. I've watched a ton of long-form videos on YouTube explaining characters, races, storylines, lore, and it's such an interesting and engaging universe. You know, I feel like it kind of scratches that itch from when all I would read as a kid were Star Wars Expanded Universe titles. But back to the actual game review, Space Marine 2 is a direct sequel to 2011's aptly named Space Marine 1. It's a third-person shooter and hack-and-slash title where, this is crazy, you play as a Space Marine. And I'll be keeping this a spoiler-free review, as the adventures of Lieutenant Titus and company should be saved for you to experience yourself. And as always, these are my opinions and mine alone. Starting off with the graphics, Space Marine 2 is absolutely stunning. No visual gimmicks here. This game is shooting for realism, and they achieve it. I mean, this is one of the best looking games I have played all year and probably ever on the PS5. Forest worlds are lush and teeming with plant life, while the crumbled stone of cities immerses you in the environment. The skyboxes are just gorgeous, full of color, and so nice to look at that they distract from the gameplay. You know, there's so much going on around you, and I'm just sitting here like, man, I just want to look up at the sky. It looks great. But what really sets Space Marine 2 apart is the scale of the visuals you're looking at. One of the coolest aspects of the Warhammer lore, in my opinion, is just the sheer scale of everything. You know, there are planets with cities on top of cities, on top of cities, on top of cities, and the size of buildings can be unlike anything we can imagine on Earth. Like, imagine Mount Everest, but it's just a city, and it's just been built up, and there's millions, if not billions, of people living in it. That's the kind of scale that exists in the Warhammer universe, and the environments in Space Marine 2 accurately capture this feeling. When I'm walking on a walkway towards an enormous Gothic cathedral, I look down and see countless streets and buildings trailing down below me. I can't even see the surface. But when I look up, behind the massive church, there are what appears to be miles of structures rising above me in the distance. Many of the maps you explore during the campaign have these huge open air sections that allow you to really appreciate the true scale of these structures. And what compounds this enormous scale needs to be explained by giving some history about the development team, because Sabre Interactive's previous flagship release was World War Z back in 2019. And that game was unique in that Sabre built a custom engine to be able to render hundreds of zombies on the screen at the same time. And it turns out that this was the perfect tune-up for a Warhammer game, because what sells the scale more than the enormous structures in each environment is seeing Tyranid swarms, basically alien swarms, barreling down at you. You know, the first time you see it, it is jaw-dropping. There are countless, just hundreds upon hundreds of enemies rushing you. And once you realize you're getting hit markers when you're shooting into the swarm, you know you have to lock in. It's just a 10 out of 10 job of selling the Warhammer universe visually, in my opinion, as a very casual fan. And it would be unjust of me to not mention the Space Marine armor as well. I'll talk about how it feels to control later, but visually, they're as intimidating as I think they should be. Hulking masses of thick armor that are quickly stained with blood as you run in and pulverize the Xenos with your melee weapons. And the sound design makes that pulverizing sound awesome. You know, the steps of your Space Marine are loud and heavy, and both your guns and melee weapons have satisfying sounds as they are used. Unfortunately, there's not too much to write about the soundtrack. You don't really hear much past the loud firing of your weapon, the alien battle cries happening around you all the time, and the shouts of your Space Marine as he brings a chain sword into an enemy's chest. If you are easily overwhelmed by sights and sounds, this is probably not the game for you. But the gameplay of Space Marine 2 is an absolute blast and great to control. Controlling your character is... I was really impressed how they managed to pull this off. It's a great balance of speed and power, as you don't move so fast that it's distracting. You know, since you're basically a walking tank, if you're dashing around at super high speeds, it would just look weird. But you also don't feel slow and weighed down by the armor. I thought the movement speeds, the sprint speeds were really well optimized. The gunplay is tight and packs a punch, but once you get used to the melee combat, that's the best part in my opinion. Space Marine 2 features a parry system with melee combat, as well as different combos depending on what melee weapon you may have. I will admit, it does take some getting used to. I played the game on the recommended hard difficulty and found myself getting overwhelmed by enemies frequently early on, and there were times it just felt frustrating, like I was just getting stun locked and I was trying to be the Space Marine and run in there and kill all the enemies, and it didn't feel right. Obviously, I was getting better at the game as I played and as I continued to learn the combat, but over time I thought this was interesting. The enemies and enemy density changes with me and with you as the player as you go through the campaign, and combat did feel a lot more player friendly over time. Like some of the situations I got in early campaign, I'd feel like didn't exist late game. The early Tyranid swarms, I do think could have used some balancing. You know, as I was mentioning, I felt like I was being punished too much by trying to melee, but I will admit, and anyone that's played through this game will agree with me, part of it is the fact that you can't just run in and button spam on higher difficulties. There is an element of patience and skill you have to learn to execute and play this game successfully and be able to run through the combat without getting downed a bunch of times. Just takes a little bit of getting used to. Now, my favorite part of the gameplay is by far the finishers. You know, once you get everything down, you know the mechanics, you're patient enough to not be spamming buttons, spamming grenades. When enemies are low health, they flash red, you run up to them and eliminate them in spectacular fashion. And what I love about these finishers is how relatively long the animations are. You know, in a lot of games, people want like real quick animations, quick finishers to get back to the action. It feels like the opposite here. Having these nice long animations makes the impact seem heavier. And the iframes also give you a chance to breathe with everything going on around you. Running up to an enemy with the Thunder Hammer to baseball bat swing them into oblivion was satisfying every single time. And every time I did it, I found myself spinning the camera around the animation and just appreciating how satisfying it was. Probably my favorite singular moment in the game are those Thunder Hammer finishers. And there's also a mechanic called Gun Strike where you can do a slow-mo pistol shot after staggering an enemy. That's a way to get some armor back, have a chance to breathe in all the chaos. And if the person that decided on the overdramatic camera movement is listening to this review, nice job. It looks awesome. And I know it's been a almost all around positive review here, but that's just because the Space Marine 2 is really good. Space Marine 2, it ran really well on my PS5. I had very rare frame drops, no crashes. The loading times did feel a bit long, but I will absolutely take that if once I'm in, it all works well, which the game did. And moving on to the story, I won't talk about any spoilers here, but it was genuinely really good and really well written. Lieutenant Titus was a fun main character, and the craziness that he and his squad goes through keeps you on the edge of your seat, and each mission feels fun and new. The biggest drawback of the campaign is really just the length. It's a fun linear story, but at less than 10 hours for a $70 list price, it's hard to recommend right now. There's also 2 additional modes, I will say, a competitive multiplayer where you fight against other players, as well as other PvE missions called Operations. And the implementation for Operations was extremely cool in that they tie in directly to the main story. So listen to this. For instance, a main story mission might have Lieutenant Titus, the main character you're playing, tell another squad to branch out, secure a sector, take down this enemy. He gives them these orders over the comms. You hear them say, yep, we're going to go do it. And later on in your mission, it's, yep, we've done it. The operations, when you're going to the missions, you're playing as that other squad on that mission. You hear Lieutenant Titus come in, give you the order, you go do it, and you relay it back to him. Just a really cool integration of the main story as well as these little optional side missions. The multiplayer and the operations, they also feature weapon and class trees, as well as some extremely detailed Space Marine customizations. I know I'm not going to be getting too into it, but hardcore fans will have a ton of progression to work towards. And that's really my biggest thing. Unless you're going to be hyper investing into Space Marine 2, which I know there's going to be plenty of people that will, and they're going to have a wonderful time. For me, at least, there was really only a dozen hours of content here. I played the whole campaign, completed each operation once, and played a few multiplayer matches in that time. It's at the end of the day, it's really not a long game. It's a great game. It's a well-polished game. I'm going to be giving Space Marine 2 an A because it's a fun and awesome experience. A lot of reviewers compare it to the old Gears of War titles, and I can see some of the comparisons, but I want to give them their credit. They branched out on their own, and it's a great, fun experience. But with how short it is, I'm not going to be recommending it at its current price. Once it gets slashed down to like $30, hopefully during a holiday sale, absolutely pick it up because you're going to have a blast for a couple weekends as you're playing it. But that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been listening to Remap, the gaming podcast. My name is Jared, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.